You're listening to the Grassroots Church podcast. We're a Jesus-centered community in Thunder Bay, Ontario. You can learn how to participate more by going to our website at grassroots.church.
Let me just recap as we get into this morning about where we've been. We're doing this series on spiritual maturity, and before we kind of figure out where we're going this morning, let me just kind of talk about where we've been. So this sermon series has come out of my observation, many of us observing, paying attention to the news over the past few months that has come across our news feeds as we watch the news, whatever, and we've been watching this and finding ourselves very uncomfortable with what we are witnessing unfold in our world. But more than that, many of us have been watching the church's response to what is unfolding in our world, and we've been sort of shaking our head and just kind of dumbfounded at how so many in the church, and I'll speak to my own personal story, not friends within the church, not necessarily Grassroots, but within the larger church, friends who are endorsing, supporting, at the very least being complicit in some of these shifts in our culture that are taking place in our world, more specifically in the States, but also unfolding in Canada, if you have eyes to see, and seeing how there is this endorsement of that from within the church. And these are policies and shifts that most certainly exploit the most vulnerable in our communities and in our society. And so people either are, unintentionally ignorant because of, say, their algorithms on their social media feeds are just not showing this stuff that's happening. That's one reason. Some of them are intentionally ignorant and they're denying that this is actually happening. And I think what's worse is they're not denying it, but they're actually seeing what's unfolding as part of God's goodwill in this world, and this is a reflection of God's actual character and his nature. And that is troubling to many of us. And I've had good conversations with a number of you as well who have come to me and have said things like, what is going on? Make this make sense. And the best I can do is frame this, and I think there's different ways of framing this, but one way that we can frame it, the way that I've chosen to frame this, is a form of spiritual immaturity, which is not to point fingers at them always, but it's also to point fingers at ourselves and take a look inside and recognize, where do we lack in this? The first, of course, is this reality that even a tertiary walk through the gospel, even just like a surface level, let's just consider what is on the pages of the gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We see a Jesus who unabashedly is on the side of the weak, the poor, the oppressed, the fringes of society, don't we? Right? So that goes without saying, that is what I don't care how you interpret scriptures, that's very obvious. I think in my mind, I don't say the Bible is clear very often, but I would say this is a very clear teaching, very clear direction of scripture in this regard. So that's the first part. And to miss that is to miss, a good chunk of what makes up our faith. But beyond this, we looked at, in our first week in this series, maturity is not just being able to read the way of Jesus in the gospel, but maturity is being able to see how Jesus refers to our ability and our willingness to love others in a way that costs us something. This is most highlighted specifically and directly in his teachings in Matthew 5 on the Sermon on the Mount. But again, it is all through the New Testament, right? It is easy to speak about loving God and loving others, and what we're going to talk about this morning. It is really hard to love in a way that actually costs us something, that requires sacrifice. But as the cross perfectly embodies and represents, this is exactly the kind of love that Jesus' followers are to practice. And it ain't easy. So that conversation, that was first week, and that led us to consider empathy as this superpower that leads us to greater maturity in things like we talked about last week, selfish ambition and vain conceit. That's what the Apostle Paul talks about in Philippians 2 as these sort of barriers to being able to embody empathy and to practice this way of love that Jesus demonstrates for us. And this is really clever. I came up with this myself. If maturity is well-toned muscles that allow us to get stronger so that we can love better, then maybe empathy is like the protein shake that we use to grow those muscles, right? It like speeds it up. It helps it grow faster. That's pretty good, right? Like you can visualize. I'm not great at metaphors, but I thought that was a good one. If you want to use that on a T-shirt or something, you're allowed to do that. I asked for 10% of the profits. That's all I'm asking. I'm very generous. So anyway, so that's kind of my thing. That's how I'd like us to think about that. And so over the last 2 weeks, we've been contemplating this response to those who sit on either end of the spectrum, right? This is the response that we are to show them, asking ourselves, what is it like to walk in their shoes, to understand the world as they do? And hopefully, both in your own practice of employing empathy in your lives and the people that kind of rub you the wrong way, but maybe you watched a video this past week from the Enemy Project. Anyone watch any of those videos? Yeah, pretty good. So yeah, did you enjoy them? Yeah, were you challenged by them? Yeah. So hopefully, whether it's through your own experience, through watching videos, whatever, but your encounter with intentional empathy has helped you to see that those people who are different than you are not the bad guy, right? That we can't label them as evil because they are on the other end of the ideological spectrum than us. We can't dismiss them or roll our eyes at them. We have to see them first and foremost as humans who operate just like you and I out of fear, who operate out of concern for their children, for their own lives, for the world around them. These are people, like they operate out of the same instincts that you and I operate as well. And I think empathy allows us to access that truth, to access that reality, and then we can move out from there. So to see that reality is not just a measure of maturity, it's also what's needed for us, I believe, to overcome this polarization in our day, right? This tribalism that is increasingly becoming stronger and stronger. This separating, the us and them, all of this stuff. And so I think empathy is our path to that. And that, unfortunately, is a very pronounced reality within the church today as well. And so we all, I think, are guilty of this to some degree. So, empathy is powerful and necessary, and I would argue it is a fundamental quality, a fundamental trait of what every follower of Jesus should strive to be defined by. Empathy should be a part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. We should be working on those muscles regularly. And this is where we want to go this morning. Empathy is only the beginning. Gets even harder, if you can believe it. Empathy is only the beginning. And so being able to, last week we talked about overcoming selfish ambition, being able to overcome vain conceit that we all struggle with in order to attempt to understand where the other is coming from, that's key. And again, we spent 2 weeks focusing on that and realizing how important that is. And it is a sign of maturity, and it needs to be cultivated within the church, perhaps now more than ever. But hear this. If all we ever do is feel with someone, and we never actually respond with action out of that feeling, then yes, we are on our way to being mature, but we've stopped short of what Jesus would say is the full measure of maturity. Again, if I can use my really solid example or an analogy of seeing empathy as the protein powder that grows our muscles, these muscles are built for a singular purpose, and that is to carry the weight of costly love. All right? So this morning I want to look a bit more into what is to flow from empathy, which is love in action. And I want to look at the epistle of 1 John to do this, because 1 John is all about this, and we'll talk about this in just one sec. And so a little bit of context. John is, at the time of writing, this is near the end of the first century. It's about 60 years-ish past when Jesus ascends to heaven, and so kind of picture 60 years on from there. And he is writing this letter. This is the first letter there's 3 letters. This is the first one, and he's writing it to the church that is going through a bit of a crisis. Now, the crisis in the church that John is addressing is not exactly the same as our churches, but there are certainly parallels. Some folks had walked away from the community, and there are these new teachings that had crept in that twisted the truth about who Jesus was. Does that sound familiar? This was part of a movement called Gnosticism. How many people have heard this word before? Gnosticism. And to make it very simple, and perhaps too simple, but it essentially taught that the physical world was evil. And therefore, that led to denying these truths about Jesus, that he lived in a physical body, right? Because why would this good God embody an evil physical body? So it denied the physical life of Jesus, the humanity of Jesus. And so John recognized what's at stake with the logical outworking of Gnosticism in the church. If you take away the humanity of Jesus, you then take away the cross. And if you take away the cross, you take away this perfect example of sacrificial, other-centered love, right? And all you're left with is a Jesus who is distant and detached and kind of abstract, sort of untouchable. He's out there. And a little more than a mascot, you might say. And again, do we see those parallels in the church today? And so John insists that we need to hold on to the flesh and blood of Jesus. This is key. We cannot be followers of Jesus without this reality. And throughout the epistle, there's just a few chapters, it's not super long, but throughout this epistle, he insists that Jesus' love was proven not in ethereal, sort of disembodied words that he gave us. That's not the demonstration of Jesus' love. The demonstration of Jesus' love was in his action being on the physical, rugged suffering on the cross. And so that then becomes John's challenge to you and I today. Well, first of all, to his church, but then to you and I as well. If we belong to this same Jesus, he says, then our love must reflect what Jesus' love looked like. Our love to one another can't be demonstrated just in speech and in words, but in action and in truth. And so I think about our context this morning, again, as we look at the way the church at large has responded to the news and all that we are witnessing these days, we are too frequently seeing a very different understanding of this Jesus than is revealed in the Gospels, revealed in that sacrificial, others-oriented, cruciform love. And friends, the world sees that. The world has their critiques of the church, and much of it is warranted. Some of it's not. But if we're honest, much of that critique is warranted. And guess what? They too are repulsed in the same way that many of us are repulsed by what we are witnessing in our church, in the church today. I mean, John is pretty blunt. Here's what he says near the end of the letter, chapter 4, he says this: whoever claims to love God, right? So you got this love of God that you're boasting about, but you hate your brother or your sister, they're a liar. For whoever does not love their brother and sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. In other words, if you claim to know God, but your life doesn't show it in very real, very practical forms of love that alleviates the suffering and hardship of other brothers and sisters, then you're lying. You're deceiving yourself. So for John, the real test of faith, and this is important, the sign of maturity, we could frame it this way, is not how spiritual you sound by the words you use or what you say that you believe. That is not the measure of maturity. And it's certainly not by how much we confess to love God. That was not that important to Jesus. It's important, but it's not the measure of maturity in John's eyes or in Paul's eyes or in Jesus' eyes. Instead, it's whether we are actually willing to love in the way that Jesus loved us, with actions, with sacrifice, with flesh and blood commitment. And this, as we can see, will be the heartbeat of the entire letter that John writes. It's the very means of how he hopes and intends to confront the false Jesus that is seeping into the church. He's like, let's turn around and be a witness to the world that is so strong and so powerful, people will be compelled by us instead of repulsed by us, right? So this is what he writes in chapter 3, and this is kind of where we're going to camp out a little bit. He says this, if you want to follow along, 1 John 3, verse 16 to 18. He says, this is how we know what love is. Good. It's super great. He's going to just define it for us, and then it's easy. Jesus laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possession and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. So again, John begins by defining what the love is that we're talking about. And it's a kind of love that, again, can only be demonstrated through action. In this case, it's Jesus laying down his life at the cross. Now let me ask you this. Is it not true? Is it not true? And maybe I can only speak for myself here, but does it not seem that oftentimes this is where our confession of love stops, if we're being honest, right? We confess to love God for his goodness. We love God for the cross. We love God for all that he's just done for us and saving us. And that's not bad. Of course, that's not bad. Don't get me wrong. Don't hear me say that. It's good to confess, to sing this, to reflect this in our prayers of gratitude and all of this. Absolutely. But it's like empathy in this way. Okay? It's important. It's necessary. It sets the compass in the right direction. We need empathy in order to truly love others. So it has to start there. But empathy without a response in the form of actionable love is sentimentality. It's just sentimentality. It's like, oh yeah, I really feel for them. But it doesn't do anything, right? And here's the thing. If our response to the other is little more than, I get where they're coming from. Yeah, I understand, man, that must be tough. But it doesn't move beyond that sentiment. Then I hate to say this, but that's just immaturity in disguise. And how many of us are guilty of that? Again, I don't want to be pointing fingers and wagging fingers at us today. This is a message for me more than anyone, I think. But this is the truth. Like, it's so much easier to just confess those things and then leave it there. And that is really just immaturity in disguise. And so in the same way, love of God, which we're all very comfortable to profess, that we love God, we love Jesus, all that is wonderful. It can begin with worship and with adoration and with praise and all that. But if words and speech are all that it amounts to, then it's just immaturity in disguise. Do you follow? See, I didn't come up with this, but we might say this is, the first part is a vertical love. How many people have heard of this? Like this idea of like, it's just me and God, the old man in the sky. I'm just worshiping him and loving him, and I could just do this all day long, and it's really beautiful, right? That's important, and that's part of the faith, the life of faith, and that's great. But John says that for us to show that vertical love that we're confessing to God, it needs to be horizontally demonstrated. We love each other, one another, or we love one another, right? We love this way to express this way. We can say this way. Our horizontal love expresses how sincere our vertical love is. And again, if you want to use that, 10% of profits go to me. That's fine. It's clever. But this is the thing. Right? We all have no problem with the vertical love. Like, oh yeah, Lord, you're so good. I just want to praise you all day. And John is saying, like, honestly, it can't stop with just speech, with just words. It has to be embodied. It has to be lived out to one another. John says it's not enough to just use words and speech to proclaim, wow, it's beautiful. Thank you for the cross. I love you, Jesus. Because again, the church is really, really good at that part. We don't struggle with that. I don't think. I see that all the time. It's easy for us to sing songs proclaiming our love of Jesus and the cross, which is why I'm so glad Rhonda sang this morning. They will know we are Christians by our love, not by our confessing, bowing down and loving God. Of course, we do this, but they will know that love is real by how we love one another, by how we express that love to each other. And so then John gives a very concrete example of what that, and in case there's any doubt of what loving one another looks like, he's like, here, let me break it down for you, friends. If anyone has material possessions, we all have material possessions, and we see a brother or sister in need, and we decide not to have pity on them, and we're like, they'll figure it out some other way, right? If that's our response, then John says, how can the love of God be in that person? He's saying it's simply impossible to be all about the vertical love and neglect the horizontal love. You cannot do the first without the second. No matter how much we have been taught that it's all about just loving God, loving God, loving God, he actually wants us to love each other. Like, it's weird how closely intertwined those are. They are inextricably linked. You cannot have one. You cannot have the vertical love of God without the horizontal love of one another. And if that doesn't convict you this morning, then I don't know if you're paying attention, because that is really uncomfortable for me to hear. It's meant to stop us in our tracks. If anyone has material possessions, and we see someone in need, it says brother or sister. It's not limited to that, right? If we see need around us and we carry on in our own, self-assured, yeah, we're fine, somebody else will figure it out. Like, that is a hard word. Then how can the love of God be in that person? How can they confess that? So this is more than just words, more than just confession, more than just empathy. Actually, physically meeting the needs of those around us. And what happens when we give of our material possessions, when we physically meet the needs of someone else? It literally costs us something, right? And this is what costly love is. Love that costs us something. That's the measure of maturity that we are looking at in this series, right? And see, this isn't coming from John directly. John grew up, as a young disciple 60 years earlier under the teaching of his rabbi, Jesus. And wouldn't you know it, this is exactly what Jesus taught, right? Matthew 25, a very familiar passage to many of us. Jesus was before all of his followers, and he said that when we cared for the hungry and the thirsty and the stranger and the naked and the sick and the imprisoned and so forth, when we did all that, we were actually demonstrating love to God himself. This is not new to John. This is the gospel. All through the gospel, it's penetrating the entirety of the New Testament. This is the ethic we are to live by. It says, truly I say to you, as you did it to the least of one of these, as you did to any of these people, you did it to me. And so this, friends, is how we demonstrate this vertical love to one another. We prove our love to God. They will know we are Christians by how we love one another. This week, Ron and I read in our devotion a little passage about Mother Teresa. And she was speaking about her community, the Missionaries of Charity, and she defined it as ministry with Jesus, for Jesus, and to Jesus. And the author of the devotional said the with and the for referred to serving in the power and the grace of Jesus, but the to Jesus was always confusing. What do you mean to Jesus? And so he writes this: Mother Teresa spoke often about recognizing Jesus in the face of those she served. In her mind, Serving a homeless child wasn't just ministry in Jesus' name. It was literally ministry to Jesus. Mother Teresa understood that you don't change the world by trying to change the world. Instead, you set your heart upon Jesus because of his surpassing value. And in the process, you begin to see the presence in every person, his presence in every person you encounter. So I wonder if this is an element that is missing in our church today. Maybe part of the church's immaturity, part of the reason for our bewilderment as we look at the church in the West and its response of endorsement, response of, at best, complacency, at worst, endorsement of some of the things that are happening, especially toward the vulnerable in our society, is due to an overemphasis on the vertical love of God and a neglect of the horizontal love of one another. Again, that vertical is important, and we're not denying that. But not if it is at the expense of actually seeing the face of Jesus in those in need all around us. Caring for them. This is the horizontal love. This is an expression of our love for God. And it seems to me that there is a disconnect in the church. We have severed those two loves, right? John writes this, "Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with action and in truth." So what does it mean to only love with words and speech rather than action and truth? The thing that comes to mind, quickest in my mind in our day and age is, and it's almost become a meme. It has become a meme in our world. It's this, after every tragedy that happens in our society, what do we see online? Thoughts and prayers. Yeah, exactly, right? You all know it. It's almost embarrassing at this point, isn't it? And I'm not denying that praying for the aftermath of tragedy is important. Of course it is. Nobody is denying that. But if all of our thoughts and prayers amount to thoughts and prayers and nothing beyond that, no stepping in the way to actually alleviate suffering, to offer help in whatever small way, shape, or form we can, then it is, again, I don't know, it is essentially worthless. Can I dare say that? Like our thoughts and prayers are worthless if there's nothing to follow up with. If there's no willingness to actually get out and serve. And friends, the world sees that. Everyone out there is like, oh yeah, here's the thoughts and prayers coming from the church. Great guys, thanks a lot. And they move on, right? Or those churches and Christians that, another example, they might preach love from the pulpit, but they are so quick to get involved with those, I don't know, no other word I have other than gross sort of culture war tactics, right? Demonizing the other, mocking their opponents, right? Celebrating political wins over compassion. All of that ickiness and seeing the churches jumping on board, right? That's not love, right? Or sadly, another example, the rampant cover-up. This has happened in the last couple of decades, I suppose, but especially it seems lately. Cover-up of abuse scandals in the church, all in the name of protecting, the dignity and the witness of the church, and thereby silencing and often re-traumatizing victims. Nothing undermines we love God more than institutional self-protection at the expense of the most vulnerable. And guess what? The world also sees that, don't they? Right? And we could go on, but the point is we don't have to look very far to see why John was so emphatic that our love needs to be more than words and speech. It needs to be action. It needs to be truth. So what might it look like for you and me this morning to love horizontally this way, as an expression of our vertical love this way. What does that look like? And the beauty of love in action is that its limit is basically our imagination. There are endless ways that we can demonstrate this love. And it might be spending an evening helping a neighbor with childcare, or quietly covering someone's grocery bill or their rent, not because you're going to get a tax receipt for it, not because there's a public, affirmation of this, but because you see a need and you're like, I can meet that need with what material possessions I have. I'm able to do that. Or particularly in today's political climate, again, constantly going back to this topic, it might be expressed as standing publicly with someone who's been stigmatized or marginalized in our society, right? Whether it is an immigrant, maybe it's a First Nations person in our community, an unhoused neighbor, maybe it is an LGBT plus co-worker who you stand in solidarity with, when all other Christians around you, or many other Christians around you, would say, wow, look at how compromised they are. And you insist that you will stand with them. Like, that is a form of love. That is an action, right? I read a thing yesterday that just kind of reminded me of this and said, oh, we could do this as well. And this is a thing online, some IG post on my timeline. It said this: unpopular church evangelism idea. Listen to this. What if we became notorious for being the most generous tippers in your society, in your city? It's close to home. What if we became known not for our hot takes or mic drops or clever quips, but for extravagant, unreasonable generosity? When we're generous, we are mirroring God's generosity. We reflect, for God so loved the world, he gave, right? Our generosity is a reflex, a response to his generosity to us first. We are made in the image and likeness of a generous God. We love because he first loved us. To tie generosity to love in action. I mean, it's a no-brainer that, yes, this is what we should do. But imagine if, as a community, we became notorious for just extravagant generosity, extravagant giving, tipping at the restaurant beyond that minimum 15%. That's what I do. Sorry. But isn't that love in action? It's all of this stuff and a million other ways that we embody love, that we put flesh and bone onto this vertical love of confession, of loving God. If empathy moves us to feel the pain and the hurt of others, then love responds by addressing the pain and hurt of others in any way that we are able to. So, what is our takeaway this morning? This is not a complex message. It's a hard message, but this is not a complicated message. I think our takeaway is just that I think we needed a reminder. We always need this reminder because it's so tough. That love, like empathy, is mere sentimentality if it doesn't move us toward action. Amen? When we look at the world, we see lots of Christians who talk about love, who make posts about love, who sing about love of God, and all of that is beautiful, and that's a vertical sentiment, a vertical confession of love, and it's great. And John would say that if words and speech are all that this amounts to, then we've still got a lot of growing up to do, right? We've still got a lot of growing up to do. Maturity is measured in you and I actually stepping across the divides, inconveniencing ourselves, sharing our resources, defending the vulnerable, loving our enemy, not just by feeling where they're coming from, an absolutely critical and crucial component of this, yes, absolutely, but then moving beyond that and giving them our time, our energy, our resource, whatever it might be. Loving in a way that costs us something. And the only way we can do this, I think, is by seeing the face of Jesus, the very one we say we love, in the face of those around us, in the face of each other, the face of our enemy as well. That's the takeaway. Vertical love expressed in horizontal love. Does that make sense? I want to end with this quote from St. John Chrysostom, the 4th century. And this is a preacher who was all about love in action. This is his big thing that he often spoke about this. And here's what he says, and I'll end with this. Let us show our love in deeds more than in words. Listen to this. For deeds are the soul of love.